Oh, reader, come closer. It is time to talk about my January reads. So, the month of January, to some extent, has flown by, but while it was happening, it felt like it took forever. Which also means we have some 9 books, I think, to talk about within this month. 9 books that I got done. I did manage to read like over the 100 page a day mark, which is basically sort of like my benchmark when it comes to my reading. Now, for the month of January, we are starting a new year, and I have yet to film my goals video for 2026, but I'll already spoil it by saying that the keyword for 2026 is going to be spontaneity. I don't want to make choices about my reading ahead of time. I don't want to be deciding 2 months ahead of time, like, oh, this book I'm gonna place in that month, because you know next month is already fully slotted in. I cannot fit anything else into next month, so it'll have to be the month after that. And mainly that is because I don't want to feel in the moment like, oh, I would really want to pick this book up and not have the possibility to do so, because I've already like said I was gonna read so many books, and even though most of those will not be like sort of like obligation reads, as in they're not for book clubs, they're not time sensitive stuff, I'll still feel like I'm stuck to that TBR to some extent. And it isn't just because I told you guys, so it is mainly sort of like I've made a plan, I'm sticking to the plan. So we are not making plans, that is a conclusion. So that means that January is the first month of my experiment to try and just read as I want to, not let other things kind of get in the way of me just spontaneously picking up whatever I want in a month. So let's start at the beginning, because there is one book that I was basically, that failed this spontaneity check, I guess, because there is one book that I kind of knew ahead of time I was going to try and fit into this first month of January, but it was still spontaneous in the sense that I wanted to fit the entire first series into the month of January, and that didn't end up happening. I read the first one. Through my choices of what to read spontaneously, I just didn't get around to the second or third one within that month of January, so I'll still take it as a given, and I did do a spin in order to kind of land. I think I did a spin. I'm not entirely sure now whether I did a spin for it or whether I was just so convinced that I wanted to start with that I didn't do a spin. But in any case, I wanted to do a serious reading vlog for this, so I started in January. So the book that I'm talking about is Magician by Raymond E. Feist, which is part of the oldest series that is on my TBR. I do have a second book in the series on my TBR that is a little bit older on there, but this is a full series on my TBR, and I wanted to get one of my 2 full series off of the TBR pretty quickly within 2026. So Magician by Raymond E. Feist is on the older scale. I think it's from the 70s or 80s, maybe 90s, but this is a classic fantasy series in which we're following 2 boys, I would say. We're mainly following Puck, but we're also following his friend Thomas, I think his name is. These are 2 boys who are growing up in a keep, and when they come of age, basically somebody needs to tutor them in their craft in order for them to become sort of like their apprentice and their successor. And one boy is chosen to join sort of like the military ranks. The other boy originally thinks like, oh, nobody's choosing me, but then a sort of like unlikely occurrence happens, and he's chosen by the magician, who has actually never taken an apprentice before. And things go off from there. This also involves a confrontation with people from a different side of the world, or a parallel world, which they are trying to basically invade this world, and so there's war going on within this book as well. Now, I have read a companion series to this. I've read the Empire trilogy that Raymond E. Feist co-wrote with Jenny Wurtz, and the Empire trilogy I absolutely love. It's very dear to me. I read it when I was in my early 20s, probably, maybe late teens, and this is one of the first fantasy series that I've read, and one that is very near and dear to me as a consequence. And I assume it would still hold up to this day as well, because I know some people who have read it more recently as well. But with this one, I will say This is a very sort of, you know, classic fantasy. It is an adventure story. It is told in a way in which we don't really get too much into the brain of our characters. We definitely have inklings of what they're feeling and of what their motivations are, but not to the extent that I like to read. I like my fantasy books to have a really much deeper exploration on the character and to be very much character focused and looking at how the character develops through what is going on with him, whereas this is definitely still more focused on the actual events taking place. So it is a storytelling style that just isn't my favorite. That doesn't mean that I struggled with this book, but it just means that it's not like my favorite type. I listened to this one. I definitely think I will try to read the second and third one physically, because I do feel like my intrigue level was high enough to follow along, but it also meant that I myself was quite detached from the listening experience. And I think while listening, if you are emotionally detached, it already kind of deteriorates the experience, versus if you are like physically reading and you have to put in a little bit more of an effort. I think that that just works a little bit better for me when I'm not necessarily fully gripped or hooked by the story. So hopefully if I get to books 2 and 3, I'll just have a little bit more of an intentional feeling with my reading, rather than I'm just going through the motions and undergoing the story, which is how I kind of felt about my time with book 1. It was interesting to look at events from this side of the world, but I do have a preference for the other side of the world. This side of the world is very sort of like medieval European, whereas the other side of the world is feudal Japan. And I've just always had an interest in Asia and in sort of like the older Asian societies. And so yes, that is just a societal model that I'm more drawn to seeing more about, experiencing, whereas, you know, medieval fantasy, I've read it, I've been there, I've done that. I mean, I've done that is saying a lot, but it just doesn't really float my boat. Next up, I started a series, and I'm going to be talking about 3 books in this series just within one go, because it doesn't really make sense for me to necessarily talk about them separately, because I went into them one after the other, and I've actually in the meantime already finished the 4th and currently final one of that series, and that is the Morgan Crow series. So Kitty from the channel Kitty and the Books, which I will have linked in the description box, she picked up this series, and I was like, you know what, it's been on my one to read forever, so let's just do it. I think spontaneity for me, certainly if January is any indication, will basically just kind of mean like an opportunity will arise. It will make me go, oh, should I read this now? And I'll go, okay, sure, because we're reading spontaneously, right? So I started the Nevermore series. Nevermore is a series in which we're following a young girl called Morgan Crow who is about to come of age, and this is actually a bad thing, because it has been predicted that she would die upon this anniversary. She has been treated poorly all of her life, because she's basically been seen as not a problem child, but like a child that is very ill luck, that bears ill luck, and so she constantly has to apologize for all the things that are going wrong in the lives of people around her, but also people who just casually come into contact with her, you know. But then, on the eve of her birthday, she is whisked away to a new world where she has to basically go through these trials in order to become part of the Wonder Society and claim her place there. She is, for the first time, in a good environment, an environment that supports her, an environment that believes in her. However, the trials definitely have a lot of tension built around them, and a lot of danger built around him, because she's basically smuggled into this side of the world illegally, and she's currently under the protection of these trials. However, if she were to fail, she would probably have to be sent back. Now, I enjoyed the series so far, so I enjoyed these first 3 books. I definitely think the second one is my favorite actually of the series thus far, but I enjoy the wonderful dynamics the most. I love her relationship with her rescuer Jupiter Lord and the crazy stuff that goes on with him, and I love the relationship between her and her best friend and some characters that we will grow to love throughout the series, that we will get introduced to throughout the series. Some of these characters we were only meeting in the second book, but that doesn't mean that by the time of the third book they haven't come to mean as much as her best friend does, for example. And she's also living in this sort of like wacky hotel that basically kind of like alters based on mood and desire, and that's also just really fun to see. So I enjoyed the series a whole lot. I think it's like always sitting between the 4 and the 4.5 star. I could probably talk about each individual book a little bit better if I wanted to, but I think I'll just leave it at that, as in I really enjoyed this book. I enjoyed the second one more. Can I tell you why I enjoyed the second one more? No, I actually don't really think I can. I don't really know why that one just speaks to me a little bit more than the first and the third one, because my rating is always just sort of like intuitive. And so after finishing the second one, apparently I decided on a higher rating than I did when reading the first and the third one. Definitely with the third one, I do know that there was like the storyline reminded me of a storyline in Wicked too much, and while we do something different with that, and while I did enjoy the conclusion to that book, the sort of like similarities with Wicked just made me less excited about this one, or just made it feel less fresh. And that is a stupid qualm on my end, because, you know, we've seen Trials 20,000 times. We've seen what happens in book 2 as well. It isn't like the rest of the series is necessarily doing something that no book has ever done, because no book nowadays does what no book has ever done. But somehow it bothered me in book 3 way more than it did in the other books. But yes, that is going to be it. I have definitely enjoyed it. I will definitely be continuing on with the series whenever the 5th book comes out to this, because I've enjoyed my time with them, but they've just kind of remained that. They've been wholesome books that I've enjoyed going through the motions with, and I definitely think it has really strong theming, it has strong relationships, so it definitely has all you could ask of it, but somehow it just didn't get to that 5-star range for me. Next up, we went into a reading challenge weekend, because it was time for the Read It Short challenge weekend, which I do every 3 months. So January was the first one for 2026. This is a challenge weekend in which we try to read short books, so we try to prioritize the shorter stuff on our 2 reads or 1 to reads books. So I started off with Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan, which is a book that I had just picked up in London on the 29th of December. This is a book that I've been meaning to get to for years, but I will definitely say that I mainly wanted to get to it from the time in which the movie came out, and I heard really good things about the movie, and that made me more excited about this, because this is a book that takes place in Ireland, and I have a little bit of a difficult relationship with Irish literature. I took classes in Irish literature when I was at university, and none of the books that we read for that class ever appealed to me, and I have read a few outside of that for like the Booker Prize, for example, and I didn't really care for those neither. However, my fellow colleague who lived in Ireland for a few years has given me a 5-star read last year that was by an Irish author. So I'm by no means saying I will never read Irish literature, but I definitely had some trepidation going into this, which was totally unfounded, because I love this one. This is a book that to some extent is small in scope. We're just looking at a winter in Ireland in 93 or something like that, a few years before my birth in any case it was, and we're looking at a small community, and we're looking at a man who's basically going around delivering coal within the neighborhood, and it is about the things that you should not be seeing and taking action or deciding to stay silent like everybody around you. This deals with some dark pages in the history of the Catholic Church within Ireland and their treatment of women who got pregnant out of wedlock. I don't know whether it was just pregnant ladies or just anybody who was in a relationship out of wedlock that they targeted, but definitely they have done some horrendous stuff to these women getting, like, adopting their children out to other families, so separating mother from child without the mother's consent. And you will see other things that take place within this book, basically just like torture, not really torture necessarily in the physical, in the sense of like putting the screws to them, but definitely depriving them of any type of, depriving them of proper nurture, of proper living conditions, making them toil in the hardest of conditions without actually feeding them to be able to perform that labor to a decent degree, and basically depriving them of their futures, of their opportunities in life. And so this is what this looks at. As your response to this, do you stay silent like everybody else around you? Do you condemn these women for what they have done, which at that point in time was definitely seen as a grave error against religion, against morality? And you know, do you speak up? Do you risk your personal comfort? And comfort is saying much, because these people are all struggling in difficult financial times, in harsh winter conditions. But do you sacrifice your, do you potentially endanger your personal comforts, the few comforts you have, in order to stand up for these women against an institution that is overly powerful? It is very short, it packs a punch, and it puts a lot into this short page count. So I thought this one was masterful. First 5-star of the year. Then I finished another book, which is a book that I was gifted. So this is The Healing Hippo of Hinodi Park by Michiko Aoyama, which I was gifted by Daniela from Only for a Page. This is a book by the author of What You're Looking For Is in the Library, which made it onto my favorite list of 2023, or it would have made it on 2024 if I made one. Never sure which year I read What You're Looking For Is in the Library. And this is a healing fiction, which I've been struggling with as a genre over the past year, but this one definitely did work very well for me. Maybe just because of the fact that I haven't really been consuming this genre this year, because I still wouldn't say like it was a, this will not make it onto like my best books of 2026 video, for example, but I definitely enjoyed it again. I was able to go through it and not necessarily have that reflection to myself of like, oh, this is just the same as all those other ones have been, with just like different types of stories, which is what is basically just become my problem with the genre. But so if I just consume less of it, then it doesn't bother me as much. I go into them knowing that that is more or less what the story is going to be, and if I just consume it occasionally and only when I'm just like craving that type of literature, then it seems to go fine. This is a book in which we'll be looking at, I think, 4 or 5 different people who live in the same neighborhood. And so in their park there is a little hippo statue, like not a statue, but you know, like a playground animal in the form of a hippo. And the local myth is kind of like, if you touch the part on the hippo that corresponds to a part on your body that is hurting or sick, then it will heal. And these people are not necessarily people who all are in need of physical healing, and most of them don't know about this myth ahead of the start of their stories, but they're all people who will to some extent make a visit to the park at some point in time. But I definitely don't think that the focus is really on the park and on that hippo. The hippo just like appears in all stories, so it's kind of like the binding elements. But I would definitely say that the whole neighborhood is much more of a player within this particular story. There's also this sort of like laundry service where that comes into every single story, I think. And there are connections throughout the story, as in there are characters from previous stories that you will meet in a sort of like smaller role at later stories, or just being mentioned in later stories. I enjoyed this book. The first one, for example, talks about like the academic pressure in Japan and about like not doing as well as you thought you were, and sort of like looking at the intention behind why you are studying. So this character is very much hung up on his grades, but through meeting another character he will kind of figure out that, you know, he shouldn't really be going into his studies with the intention of just getting the highest grades. If he goes into it with, you know, like a real wish to learn, a hunger for knowledge, and for just improving, then that would probably serve him much better. So this is just an example of one of the stories within this book. And then the final thing that I read throughout that weekend was Baren en Moorden by Sayaka Murata. I cannot really give you an English title for it because this is part of a short story collection in Japanese, for which another story has been translated into English, but not the full collection, nor this particular short story. So this is a short story novella. I think in this edition it is just like over 100 pages. The font could be smaller, so it is definitely on the long end for a short story, but you know, it's definitely short-ish. And this is a story about a society in which the birth rate has gone down drastically. So the government is looking for ways to encourage people to give birth. They've also developed an artificial womb so that men can also give birth on their end to try and increase the numbers even further. And they've created this incentive program where if you want to kill somebody, then you can do so if you give birth to 10 people ahead. Like if you first give birth to 10 if you first give birth to 10 children, then you're allowed to nominate somebody that you want to kill, and you will be taken to a room with that person. You kill that person, and then, you know, you've done your duty to society. In contrast, if you take a life without having gone through this legal process, then you will be sentenced to a lifetime of birthing from that point onwards. So, crazy concept, but definitely a concept that is very in line with Japanese societies and Japanese society's struggles at the moment. Japanese society is dealing with the sort of like highest deficit of young people in their gender in their society. It is definitely a elderly society that is in need of a lot of fresh blood, so it makes sense for this type of story to come out of a Japanese author. Now, Sayaka Murata is one of my favorite authors, and this setup reminded me a lot of her most recent book, which is Vanishing World, because that one definitely looks at the fall in the birth number and looks at this sort of like creation of artificial wombs in order for men to be able to give birth. And Vanishing World disappointed me, but Baren en Moorden did not. I didn't necessarily know where the story was going to go because we're following a protagonist who has no interest in taking a life or has no interest in birthing, even just voluntarily having like one kid or anything like that, but she needs to take care of her niece, I think, over the summer, and her niece starts asking sort of questions about her sister, because her sister has basically kind of gone off of the radar. She's indicating that she is living abroad, but her niece doesn't really fully understand, like doesn't fully believe that. And then one of her new co-workers at work also tells her that she knows that her sister is actually a birther. And so the story takes off from there. I cannot really say too much about what happens in this story without like spoiling major aspects of it, but I definitely enjoyed this one, and it definitely has a dark ending that we are used to from Sayaka Murata. Next up, spontaneity struck, because I had known for months that the movie Hamlet was gonna come out, but still somehow I didn't prioritize it over the past few months, which makes sense to me, of course, because like September, October, November, I had like crazy TBRs that I set for myself, so there was no space to fit it in. And December was sort of like the first month in which I tried to be spontaneous in my reading, which wasn't fully successful, but in any case, for my first month of spontaneous reading, it made sense for me not to immediately prioritize Hamlet when I didn't even know the release date yet. But so, once the movie was scheduled into my local cinema for the 21st of January, I was like, okay, time for me to start reading this, because I want to have finished this by the time that this movie comes into the cinema, which is the mistake I made with the Penguin Lessons, where I had to read it and by the time that I finished it, I only had like 2 opportunities to still go to the cinema to see it, and I missed both of those. So with Hamlet, I started it and I was in time to finish it because I basically flew through this one because it was amazing. So Hamlet by Maggie O'Farrell is a book about the son of William Shakespeare to some extent, or that at least is what the title implies. So William Shakespeare had a son called Hamlet, and back in those days the Hamlet and Hamlet are basically the same word, so when he passed away, he basically kind of paid tribute to his son by writing the play Hamlet. The book is much more about just the whole family, and I would say much more about the wife of William Shakespeare. We look at the growing of their relationship, but we also look at the darkest page in their history as a couple, losing their son Hamlet. Now the good thing about this book is that you know from the beginning that Hamlet is going to die. And I think a lot of people have accused the movie of emotional sort of like manipulation. And I don't know whether that is because it is less clear in the movie. There is a quote at the beginning of the movie, and then underneath that quote it says something like, "On the death of Hamlet and the birth of Hamlet," or something like that. And so from that quote you could infer that Hamlet is going to die, but I don't know if you're going into this movie without any background info whether you're actually understanding that. But the book is told achronologically, and that to me is one of its biggest strengths. We start off in the time leading up to Hamlet's death, and we start off on the day of Hamlet's death basically, and we start with a very I mean, it might not be the day, but like close to the death of Hamlet basically, and we start off with a very tense sequence that is often interrupted by flashbacks back to the start of the relationship between William and his wife. A very tense sequence of desperation on Hamlet's side. And I just loved it. I love the writing in this so much. This writing is rich. And if you've been around on my channel, you know that I don't like flowery writing. And what I always say with that is that I don't like the type of writing that is pretty just to be pretty. I want my writing to say something. And this writing is pretty, definitely. But it evokes so much through its choice of words. It evokes such a rich atmosphere, visuals, world, and that's just made me eat it up. And this book is filled with a lot of magic, but sort of like everyday magic, down to earth magic, because the wife of William Shakespeare, there's this story going on that her mother basically came out of the woods one day and that she married her father, and that she was basically sort of like a witch who taught all of her skills to her daughter Agnes. And Agnes is mainly raised by her mother-in-law, because her mother passes away when she's still very young, and her father takes a new wife who's very resentful towards this young child. And so Agnes is basically her mother-in-law basically tries to force her into the expectation of a woman at that point in time, an expectation for a woman in medieval UK, and she very much is rebellious, not openly rebellious necessarily. She's basically just going about doing what she wants and staying quiet whenever her mother-in-law goes against her. But she is still maintaining these skills of, knowing plants and herbs, being able to intuitively tell what is happening around her. But she also has this magical ability of being able to tell a person's thoughts or something about a person by like holding them in a certain way, and that way she can kind of find out a lot of things about that person. So this is definitely sort of like magical realist in that aspect of things. There are also things in the scene of Hamlet dying that definitely feel very magical realist, but also that sense of magic, of wonder, is definitely fully manifested through the writing style. So I ate this up. I love this. I will definitely try to read more Maggie O'Farrell, because this writing is what I mean when I want prose that is intentional, that like chooses its words for its biggest impact. I love this book. I was a little bit disappointed in the movie, I will say. I didn't go with the achronological way of telling the story, and I think that the story definitely kind of not needed it, but it definitely benefited from it. There's tension that was able to be drawn out as a consequence of telling the story in that way. That just didn't really happen with the movie. And then there are also just certain things that the book can say because of this sort of like magical realist aspect to it. It can like retrace the journey that the plague took to get to the household of William Shakespeare, that just a movie cannot really do, or it could have done, but it just decided that because of the way it was told chronologically, it just couldn't really do. But so yeah, I love this book. I'm eager for another Maggie O'Farrell. So then we finished book 2 and 3 in the Nevermore series, which I've already talked about earlier, and then I finished one book on the final day of the month that I was desperate to finish, because I will definitely say that my January choosing was spontaneous, but it also to some extent made me feel like I had not finished a book in forever, or not started a book in forever. And the main reason for that is that there are 2 books that I was basically reading throughout most of the months, which is the one that I'll talk about now, but also The Names by Florence Knapp, which will be in the February wrap-up, because I wasn't able to finish it. And so there are 2 books that I just made very, very slow progress in throughout the month, or just were on pause for a lot of the month as well. And then because I was reading 3 books in the same series, but I was basically just like reading them, finishing them, and immediately starting the next one, it didn't really feel like I was starting a new book when I started the 2nd book in the Nevermore Society, or the 3rd book. It just felt like I was continuing that same reading. So it, to some extent, for a long time in that month, just felt like I was never picking up anything new, like I was just stuck reading the same things. And not to say that I wasn't enjoying myself with Nevermore, as I indicated, but I was not enjoying myself, or not enjoying myself enough with the book that I'll mention now. So the final thing that I finished in the month of January is Crusades in Jeans by Thea Beckman, Kruistocht in Spijkerbroek. This is a Dutch book. It has been translated into English. This is sort of like a classic that many people my age will have read. It came out before, it came out in the 70s, I believe, and so it is also something that my parents potentially even read. I mean, my parents are a little bit too old for that to be their childhood, but I know like the husband of a colleague of mine, for example, he also read it in his childhood, for example. I was never interested in it because of this jeans aspect of the title. I was just like, Crusades in Jeans? Ugh, no. But I also never really looked into the story. And for Herkiet, there was a secret prompt that would save my entire Herkiet project. And the secret prompt was to read a book that you missed out on in your childhood. So the biggest title that I could think of when it came to that was Crusades in Jeans, because really this book is everywhere here, or was everywhere here. And so I read it. This is a book about a young boy who travels back in time to the Middle Ages and who misses his way back. Basically, he is doing a tour of the facility where his father works, and some very irresponsible adults are like, yeah, we've successfully got transported mice back to the past, but we now need to figure out whether we can scale it up to humans or not. And then this kid is like, I'll do it. And they're like, oh, okay, sure, why not? So they transport him back into the past, and the idea is that he'll have a few hours there, I think, and then he needs to be back on the exact same spot where he was transported to in order to be transported back. And his thought is kind of like, I will go to a tournament between 2 knights that is taking place in the city in Germany where he will be transported to. things don't end up like that. He goes back in time. He goes to this this place in Germany. However, he stumbles upon an altercation between a young boy and two assailants, I think, and he helps the young boy out by helping defeat these assailants. This young boy is called Leonardo, and he is from Bologna, and he's traveling back to Italy, and so they kind of like help each other out. But when our protagonist, whose name I for some reason cannot come up with right now, Rolf, when Rolf tries to go back to the spot where he was transported to, he finds that there's a army of kids marching over that spot, because there's basically a children crusade going on that involves 8,000 kids, I believe. It's always referred to as 8,000 kids. Towards the end of the book it does say that like some people were like the story of the children crusades kind of like got blown up and people were talking about like 13,000 kids or something like that, but it always talks about 8,000 within the book. But so yes, these 8,000 kids are marching along this road where he was transported to, so he cannot find back the exact spot where he was transported from, or he cannot reach it, and so he sees a medieval kid being transported back into the being transported forward into the future, thus claiming his position. And then he and Leonardo decide that they are going to follow this children crusade. He is like, I've missed my my ride. I cannot get back to the future, and since I don't really know what to do here, I'll just follow this children crusade along. And he kind of quickly evolves into a sort of like leadership role, because the way that he describes it, all these medieval kids are very much thought to be followers. You know, they are children from lesser families most of the time. They're children of laborers, and so their place in the world is very rigid at this point in time in history. They are not lords or ladies. They are not of the higher classes, and so they need to just keep their mouth shut and listen. And so they are just following along, and they're following these 4 individuals who are basically sort of like the rulers of this expedition. But Rolf very quickly kind of has his suspicions about these leaders and about their intentions, and whether they're not just like leading these kids into danger. And so he will always be protecting the interests of the children, where some of the leaders are basically trying to just reach Genoa as quickly as possible, because their ultimate goal is to get to Jerusalem, but they are going to cross the sea in Genoa, and they're saying like God will help us along the way. He will split the ocean when we get to Genoa. But Rolf, being a 21st century kid, doesn't really believe, not a 20th century kid, doesn't really believe in this type of reasoning, and so he's following along the crusades to kind of keep the kids as safe as possible through hardship, because they will have to be crossing over the Alps, for example, at some point in time. Now, I did like the concept of this, and I did grow to care about the story more and to be interested in these dynamics of, you know, like the modern kid with his knowledge of like infectious diseases, for example, of the geography that they were going to be crossing, and these medieval kids and their sort of like belief in God, their like, you know, like all-being belief in God, and their all-consuming trust in higher-ups and in the intentions of the clergy, for example. And that definitely did interest me, but I definitely felt like the story was way too long and told once again in this sort of like remote fact-first type of writing style that I also saw in A Magician, where, you know, we are relaying a story and the story is what matters most, whereas what I as a reader mainly like to take away from the books is thematics, or is character evolution, or just like character, like getting to know the character, understanding the character. And so this type of writing is not interested in that, is not interested in exploring the depth of characters. It is telling the story and what is unfolding, and we glean an understanding, of course, of the character, but we never really get super close to the character. We glean an understanding of the character, but not in a deep way that I like in my modern literature. So I was struggling with it. I definitely could only read like one chapter a night. In this one, it was a struggle to get through those 10 pages of a chapter. If a chapter was 25 pages long, it's like, oh no, really? You're gonna make me go through that? So I would definitely say that I did find there to be interesting aspects to the books as I struggled through it. But if it hadn't been for this Herkiat challenge, I would not have struggled through it. I would have put it down way earlier, because it was just, the writing style just didn't work for me as a reader now, as like, it didn't cater to what I like as a reader. It didn't cater to my preferred focus in a book. So yeah. Not necessarily for me. Maybe as a child I would have liked it more, because definitely at that point in time more books were like that to begin with, and I was just also like reading more of those books as a consequence. But I was late to the reading game to begin with, and maybe, who knows, maybe that has something to do with this. Maybe I would have been more engrossed as a reader immediately if books had been different back then, but maybe most likely it was also just that I evolved as a reader over time as I grew up, as I became an adult, so that maybe if I read this book as a child I would have just gotten along with it more, because I was more of an acts first and a story first type of reader back then. But so yeah, that's all I read in the month of January. I'll put some statistics over on the screen of my reading month. Overall, I think it was a decent month. I've definitely had bigger page count months towards the end of 2025, but I'm happy with this page count, definitely. And I like that, you know, this is the page count that we kind of organically landed on, because I definitely had evenings in which I wasn't reading much, definitely towards the end of that month when I only really had Crusades in Jeans and the third book in Nevermore going on. I was definitely having a lot of days in which the page count was under that 100-page mark that I aim for normally. But I was also not too annoyed with that neither. I was not too focused on that. I did let that kind of naturally happen. I will say that, you know, I hope to not have too many experiences in which I'm forcing my way through a book the way that I did with Crusades in Jeans. But Crusades in Jeans was also really a specific reason, as in I wanted to make sure that I was still like able to finish Herkiat. I didn't want my Herkiat adventure to stop in the month of October, basically, more or less. So yes, I needed that win. I needed to get that particular reward, which is to slightly modify a Herkiat prompt so that I could count The Everlasting as a book published in October, read within not 60 days, but I will say 65, but I read it within 63, I think. But so I slightly modified that prompt in order to be able to count a book that I was just slightly late on earlier within this year when I read it in December. So we're back on track. I've already read a December book for Herkiat. I do still need to read, I do still need to read the January one, and I do definitely hope I've learned my lesson of, you know, like not waiting until the final moment to do so, because yeah, when I realized that I was not making it, I was so disappointed in myself. So I really had to finish Crusades in Jeans in order to save myself and, you know, like get myself out of that hole that I dug for myself. But so yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video. See you guys for the next one. Bye!